do. This week we have two speakers, both talented researchers at UC Davis. We've got Kelly Fleming, who works in the Policy Institute in the Institute of Transportation Studies. And we've got Alan Jen, who works in the Plug-in Electric Vehicle Research Center. And they're going to be talking about mobility and TNC, Transportation Network Company, electrification, and kind of where we're going from here with respect to decarbonizing that type of transportation. Okay, take it away, guys.
Okay, I'll start. First of all,
and also you're welcome to introduce yourself more and give us more if you feel. Yeah, thank you.
That was such an excellent introduction, Jake. I think needs no more, at least for me.
Well, I can tell you a little bit more about the Policy Institute. I'm not sure if any of you are familiar with it, but so it's not actually in the Institute of Transportation Studies. It sits parallel to it, which I didn't really understand until I had been working there for a few months. It's kind of confusing. But we're more broad than transportation. We do have people working more on energy efficiency and climate change issues. So, and we hire students. So if people are looking for graduate research work, pending whatever the university does with hiring policies, I think we still have room to hire students. So get in contact with me. I just realized I forgot to put my email on the last slide, but I'll fix that before we're done. Okay, so this is a little bit more of a broad overview of carbon emissions in the whole transportation sector. I kind of assumed a lot of you don't have much background in transportation, so I apologize if this is slightly boring, but feel free to ask questions for the end. We left a lot of time for discussion so that we can make this more interactive, because I know you've probably been staring at Zoom all day. So I'm going to start with the greenhouse gas inventory for transportation. I'm sure a lot of you have seen this before. The main point is that transportation by far is the biggest emitter in California, but this is also true nationwide. It's been this way for a bit longer in California, but in 2017 it passed industrial nationwide as well. It's also the only sector in California that's not decreasing emissions. And there are several reasons for that. So if we break it down a little bit further, you can see that passenger vehicles are by far responsible for the most amount of emissions. And then heavy duty trucks, which is mostly freight emissions. And that's us driving around alone, usually in our cars and SUVs, moving goods around, ordering things on Amazon. Some of it also comes from rail, off-road, aviation, as you can see towards the bottom there. But if you include fuels and refining, transportation is in charge of over 50% of our emissions. Muted. Okay. There we go. So why are emissions increasing even though vehicles are more efficient? We're getting to have more hybrid electric vehicles, fuel efficiency in general is improving, but for some reason emissions from transportation is still increasing. And that is because of something called vehicle miles traveled, or VMT as we like to call it. VMT is still increasing, especially in California, for a couple of reasons. People are driving more and the population is increasing. So that means there's more cars on the road. People are starting to sprawl out more, and there are a few reasons for that. People are living further from where they work than they used to, and that has to do with housing costs. And a few existing tools we have to help solve this problem are increasing ridership on public transportation and improving bike and pedestrian infrastructure. So some of you have probably seen this graphic before. It shows how much more people you can fit into a space when they're not in their own vehicles. So the one on the left is a bus, the one in the middle is bikes, and the one on the right is cars. So you can see people in cars take up a lot more space. So the more people ride the bus, it benefits everyone on the road, not just the people on the bus. That's what I like to tell.
And if I could chime in real quick,
Yeah.
Yeah, I think this is a really nice sort of segue talking about difficulties, particularly with behavioral change. So California is one of the most active regulatory and from a regulatory and legislative standpoint in terms of trying to mitigate carbon. And so when we think about the broad spectrum of like policy activity, a lot of the ones that are promoting technology, so thinking about like the zero emissions vehicle mandate, thinking about like low carbon fuel standards, I think broadly we can see that the trajectory is in the right direction. You know, whether or not we're getting to specific goals is sort of a different question, or if the goals are, you know, stringent enough. But when it comes to behavior, there are policies that do try to do that. So thinking about something like SB 375, that's the VMT one, right? And that one, unfortunately, hasn't had sort of the same level of success as we typically, or as compared to a lot of the ones that are sort of driving technology. So yeah, maybe not so surprising. Behavior is hard to change, but at least we're trying.
Right. And then another problem I wanted to highlight is called induced congestion. And California is doing a pretty good job at this, but the more we widen highways, we have research at UC Davis showing that it won't improve congestion. So adding more lanes doesn't make traffic better. It actually over time will just increase VMT and congestion will stay bad. So we kind of want to incentivize people not to widen highways and rather pick different modes of travel. And so we have this program at UC Davis and ITS called 3 Revolutions. Dan Sperling, the director of ITS, coined this term. And we have a whole program based on it. And he wrote a book based on it. I highly recommend if you're looking for quarantine reading. So the 3 revolutions are electrification, meaning moving our vehicles, both passenger, freight, and transit, to hybrid, electric, and all electric vehicles. The second one is automation, so self-driving cars, eliminating the need for a driver in some or all situations. And then finally, shared mobility, which is probably the most prominent right now, which is, shared ride hailing or shared car fleets, and things like Jump and the scooter shares. So first, I'm going to talk about the first one, which is electrification. And there has been some criticism you've probably seen from usually right-wing groups saying that electric vehicles aren't actually greener than combustion engines, and that's not true. So this map is showing a life cycle assessment coming out of the Union of Concerned Scientists. This is the most updated map they have from 2018. So it's basically showing what we call cradle-to-grave emissions. I'm sure some of you have heard of this or do this for your work. It's calculating the emissions from the mining of the materials to make the vehicle to when the car dies. And the reason it's different in different regions is because the grid mix is different in those different regions. So it's not as good for places that still use a lot of coal. And it's better for areas like the Pacific Northwest that use a lot of renewables and hydro. Still, in every place, it's better than your average sedan. And it's only going to keep improving. So like if you buy an EV now in West Virginia, you're getting 63 mile per gallon equivalent, but it's probably going to be better in a few years as coal starts coming off the grid. So then the next one is shared, and those are we call transportation network companies, which is going to be what we're going to be discussing later on. And that includes Lyft, Uber, scooter companies like Lime and Bird, and there's a bunch of others that I don't know about because we're not allowed to have them in Sacramento and Davis. Jump bikes. And then also we want to think about micro transit companies like Via, or if any of you have taken the new SAC-RT shuttle that goes around, you can hail it just like a Uber in Sacramento, and it'll take you within the downtown or midtown area. And we want to think more about that. How can these shared services help complement our transportation our public transportation rather than compete with it and take people off of the bus, but rather get people to the bus. And then finally, and then we want to talk about how TNCs are making emissions worse. So that's kind of the background of the Clean Mile Standard and why we want to implement it. So this shows a study also out of the Union of Concerned Scientists that just came out a couple weeks ago, showing that the way that we're currently using TNCs are making emissions worse. The graph on the right-hand side shows how the emissions compare depending on how you use ride hailing. So the first bar is if you drove yourself in your own car. The second one is a non-pooled ride-hailing vehicle. So that's mostly what people are using, especially in places that don't offer pooled vehicles like Sacramento. And so that's worse than driving yourself in your own car in terms of emissions. And then the next one is a pooled combustion engine vehicle. It's a little bit better than a private vehicle, but not much. And then you can see how that compares to bus and rail. And then on the very right-hand side, it shows if you took a pooled ride-hailing car to public transportation, which is kind of what I talked about with the microtransit shuttles that are available. And then on the left, you can see they have this cool little graphic showing like, it looks like you're choosing what kind of ride you want and how much CO2 that emits compared to each other.
Yeah, and like, could I jump in on that slide real quick?
Yeah.
Part of the reason why there is kind of this difference, you might ask, well, if I'm doing the same kind of trip, like, wouldn't it be pretty similar? So for example, if you were to look at the non-pooled ride-hailing, the second from the left compared to the private vehicle, actually the direct trip emissions tend to be actually a little bit lower. And the reason for that is the average car in Uber and Lyft is more efficient than the average car in like California. Uber and Lyft drivers are by far the most price sensitive. They keep track of how much they're spending on gas, and it plays a big role in the bottom line of how much money they're making. So they tend to drive more fuel efficient cars. And the reason why it actually ends up being more emitting is because of this concept called deadheading. So for those who haven't heard of this is like, think about what happens when you order an Uber or Lyft. For you to be able to go from point A to point B, well, the Uber driver also has to go from wherever they're currently located to come pick you up, and then they go and drop you off. And so all of those extra like bits of travel add up, and we work really hard to quantify that, and that's going to come into play when we're thinking about the Clean Mile Standard.
I do have a slide on deadheading.
Okay, cool. Yes, sorry.
No worries. So yeah, we'll talk a little bit more about that, but it is really important, and that's why these shared vehicles sometimes emit more. And then the third revolution is automated vehicles. So Dan Sperling coined the three revolutions to a term, and he's also kind of picky about saying automated versus autonomous. And the reason for that is automated is kind of more broad than saying autonomous. It includes vehicles that aren't fully capable of self-driving. So when we say autonomous, we mean like no human intervention is needed at all. But we already have some automated vehicles on the road. They're just not fully self-driving. So if you think about Tesla's autopilot, there are parts of public roads where you can drive those without much human intervention, although you're supposed to be paying attention with your hands on the wheel. And we do have some research on that from Scott Hardman if you want to look more at the emissions and implications of those. So this graph is one of the more commonly cited studies that shows how energy changes due to vehicle automation. I totally forgot to put the link in there, but I can send it if people are interested. So it shows the bars on the left are the aspects of an automated vehicle that will reduce energy consumption. So that's things like eco-driving mode, platooning, where the vehicles can talk to each other and follow at really close distances, so they're simultaneously braking and accelerating. That can save energy. Vehicle right sizing, that's like making sure you're driving a car that's not too big. Like we don't all need pickup trucks and SUVs if we're driving by ourselves. If you could hail a car to do what you need it to do, and only then, instead of owning your own, that would decrease energy usage. And then the bars on the right are aspects that could increase our energy consumption, so that if people don't have to pay as much for travel, they're probably going to travel more often. They're probably going to travel faster if there are no speed limits anymore. People could start moving further away from where they work since they no longer have to be engaged on their commute. And so these are kind of the scenarios that have given us these two situations we call the heaven and hell scenarios. So in heaven, this is my vision of heaven. This is actually a picture I took in Norway about a month ago, or I guess 2 months ago, before all of the lockdown happened. It's where cars or streets are shared with transit and people, and there's not too many cars on the road, and the air is clean, and you're in this nice little mountain town. And then we have the hell scenario where everyone has their own private vehicle. Half of these don't have any people in them. They're just going to pick up groceries or, drop kids off at soccer or drive back home to park because that's where it's free. And that's what we call the hell scenario, where they're combustion engines, the air isn't very clean, and we're just sitting in traffic in our empty cars watching movies or whatever. So how can policy help avoid the hell scenario? That's kind of where the Clean Miles standards.
Sorry, quick question on the last slide, please.
Yeah.
Those impacts, is that irrespective of vehicle technology?
No. So, I mean, this will depend on whether or not these vehicles are electric or combustion, and whether or not they're used kind of as like a shared fleet or they're privately owned. So we'll talk a little bit more about that as well. And one thing that I should point out is that most of the automated vehicles that are currently being tested in pilot programs are not electric or not fully electric. And part of the reason is that the computer to run all these automated features in the vehicle take up a lot of battery. So there's some studies showing that the battery range of a fully automated vehicle is like half of what it would be for a non-automated vehicle. So that makes it a lot harder for them to go very far without having to plug in.
Great, thank you.
Yeah. So, sorry, we want to talk about, we're going to focus on the Clean Miles standard, which is for, like I just said, fleet vehicles that are shared. But there are other policies that could be implemented that we're not going to talk about today, and that includes congestion pricing, or as we like to call it, decongestion pricing. Something called fee-bates, which is where you're kind of giving a rebate for someone who buys a clean car and charging someone with a particularly dirty emitting car. You charge them a fee and then rebate someone with a cleaner car with that revenue. Putting fees on automated vehicles that are combustion engine, banning combustion engine automated vehicles, putting inhibitory fees on personally owned automated vehicles. Those are all some options. California has one of the only actual policies that has been passed called the Clean Miles Standard. And we'll talk more about this, but broadly, it requires a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions per passenger mile from TNC companies, and they're responsible for implementing that. London has something similar, where all of the new TNCs have to be electric by 2025. And there's some pilot programs in some other cities like Seattle and London to incentivize TNCs to become electric. And then there are some private and public partnerships. Lyft and Uber, I think Lyft and Uber, just Uber, Alan knows, has a program called Maven Gig, where drivers can lease these electric vehicles from the company instead of paying the full upfront cost and then drive those around.
Yeah, so it's super confusing and hard to keep track of. So Maven is a specific partnership between General Motors and Lyft that lets them use the Chevy Bolts as rented fleets. And then Maven Gig is like sort of the it's kind of a combined car share ride hail platform where you can rent it for some period of time, and you're free to sort of use it across different TNC platforms. And not only TNC, I think you can use it sort of for personal use as well for maybe gigs.
Yeah, and you can use it for like delivery services and stuff, right?
That's right. Yeah.
Okay. So some challenges to electrifying TNCs are that the companies don't own the cars. The people who drive them are the ones financially constrained by this. So people who sign up to drive for Uber and Lyft tend to be lower income people, and they don't have the money for the upfront cost of an EV. And similarly, charging infrastructure is a challenge for the reason that a lot of these drivers live in apartment buildings, or we call them multi-unit dwellings, where they don't have access to a charger. So that's cost inhibitory and charging inhibitory. And just the way that the infrastructure is laid out, which Alan will talk about, he has some research on, makes it harder for TNCs to charge. And then for transit, there's it's harder to get operational savings for fuel and maintenance compared to capital expenditure because buses are so expensive to buy up front. And so I'm just going to talk a little bit about, this is some research from UC Davis from Ken Karani and Angela Sanguinetti, and then Alan will talk more about his research. So Ken and Angela, they do mostly surveys to see how drivers are using these cars. So I just pulled a few figures out of here that I thought were really interesting, showing why the drivers have chosen EVs and how they're charging them. So the number one reason they found that the drivers are choosing EVs over combustion engine vehicles, if you see ICE EV, that's what that means, internal combustion engine vehicle. So 88% of them said that they mostly chose it because they're saving money on fuel. And they were allowed to choose multiple answers. So the second most common was better for the environment. And my guess is because it's a co-benefit. You feel like you're doing something good, but you're also saving money. And then you also save money on maintenance when you have an EVs. If you think about it, you're not having to change the oil. There's not really any fluids or moving parts, so you don't have so much maintenance costs. And then the carpool lane was a big one in California because you get that sticker that allows you to get places faster. And then the next figure shows why they chose a plug-in hybrid rather than a battery electric vehicle. Again, those were what those acronyms mean. PHEVs, plug-in hybrid. So it also it's a plug-in that has a smaller electric range, and then the hybrid is like it's like a Prius that still has an engine, but it's more efficient because it's generating electricity with the braking system in the when you coast. So the reason that they chose that over a full electric vehicle is that we call it range anxiety. So they didn't want to be nervous that they were going to run out of range while they were driving a customer, or if the app told them they had to go pick someone up, they would have had to stop to charge, and that takes a lot longer than filling up a gas tank. And then that's the second most common reason. If you think about if it takes an hour to charge your vehicle, you're spending an hour where you could have been making money driving people around. So it's an opportunity cost there. And then the rest of them were, they didn't want to limit how many rides they could take based on that. There's not enough charging where they're driving around. They don't have a charger, like I talked about, if they live in an apartment or something without access, or if they don't have a garage. And yeah. Then the next one, they talked a little bit more about charging behavior to the drivers. So this surveyed them based on where they're charging, and 58% are charging at home. So that says to me most of the TNC drivers who have EVs probably have EVs because they have access to a charger. And then 36% were public chargers, 6% were workplace. And then most of them were charging from midnight to 6 a.m., meaning they're charging overnight. And then there's more grid implications of this that probably Alan can talk about, but more people were charging from 6 a.m. to noon and noon to 6 than we see from a typical plug-in hybrid or plug-in user. And then 27% 6 p.m. to midnight, which is like they get home and plug it in. So I'll pass it off to Alan now to talk a little bit about his research here.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, and I can talk about how this relates to the Clean Mile Standard as well in the next couple slides. So we've been really fortunate in being able to get data from both Uber and Lyft, and also from some charging network companies. So if you go out there and you're familiar, you may have seen some chargers out in like Target or near Whole Foods, for example. There's EVgo and ChargePoint are really big ones, and we're able to leverage a lot of that data to do some pretty interesting analysis. So what I'm showing here is actually not modeled or sort of estimated. These are real numbers coming from real data that we're sort of extracting from what we're getting from TNCs and the charging network providers. So the basic punchline of this graph on the left is like, okay, suppose you are policy oriented and you want to spend some resources on promoting an electric vehicle technology in the most efficient way possible. So on the one hand, I could, for example, do an incentive program, and I could say, okay, I'm going to take that average car in California and I'm going to replace it with an electric vehicle. And that's going to get you some emission savings, right? Because you are taking a gas car and you're turning it into an electric car. We are able to do a similar type of thing where we investigate basically how gas cars are used on Uber and Lyft platform. And we say, okay, let's replace the Uber and Lyft vehicle with an electric vehicle. And that also will give you some gas savings. And we can compare the two, right? And essentially what we find is that by replacing an Uber and Lyft vehicle with an electric car, you're getting about 3 times the emissions benefits. And so why is that? So even though the TNC gas cars tend to be more fuel efficient, which would decrease, right, the amount of savings as you switch to an electric vehicle, well, they're driving so many more miles that that your benefit is sort of like, well, these guys are driving 3 to 4 times more than your average car in California. So if you give them an electric vehicle, the per mile benefit is the same, but the number of miles that you're getting is so much larger. So that's kind of the what I'm showing here in the 2 distributions. The one on the left is the emission savings by switching a TNC vehicle to an electric vehicle, and on the right it's switching a gas vehicle to an EV vehicle. And so this is the daily kilograms of CO2 savings. So you get about 40 kilograms for TNCs and about 13 kilograms for regular gas cars. So one of the things that you might think about is, well, how big of an issue is this really? I mean, how many electric vehicles are driving for Uber and Lyft? And it turns out not that many, right? So we're getting a total of about 5,000 electric vehicles across both the Uber and Lyft platforms. This is back in about 2018. So you compare that against about 500,000 electric vehicles total. We'll say 250,000 full battery electric vehicles. So maybe 1 to 2%, which is not a huge number. And yet there are some pretty interesting implications because of the way that they're used. They use a whole lot more DC fast charging in public as opposed to charging at home, because they need to charge during the day and they need to fast charge in order to be able to provide the same level of service as other gas cars. So that 1 or 2% is using about 35% of non-Tesla fast charging demand across all of California, which is like absolutely bonkers, right? We're talking about, if you had, what's a really silly analogy? If you had someone who was like baking a cake for 100 people, and then one person comes along and eats 35 portions of cake, you're kind of like, well, I need to maybe make more cake, right? So this is the idea here, is that we're thinking about the like serious infrastructure implications of these small number of vehicles using a lot of the public infrastructure. So that's actually ongoing research that we're working on, looking at. So the little GIF on the right is showing where the activity for electric vehicles driving for Uber and Lyft is happening, and it's growing really quickly. So the darker green it is, the more rides and more pickups and drop-offs are happening. And then the red dots are essentially where the charging events are occurring. So there are like a couple reasons why you'd want to do this, right? If you put the infrastructure in the right place, that means I, as a driver, if I'm driving an electric car, less time for me to travel to go charge my vehicle, which means less deadheading, which also means, more time available for me to provide my services and more opportunity for me to make money. So there are important sort of synergies to think about here. So can we go to the next slide real quick? So all of this is kind of backdrop for the Clean Miles Standard. This is pretty new regulation, so it's not so surprising if you haven't heard of it. It's right now getting developed in the Air Resources Board. But I did want to talk a little bit about the history of this and how it came about, how it's changed over time. So the Clean Miles Standard was passed under Senate Bill 1014, and that first came into the Senate at the state level in April of 2018, and it was Senator Skinner who wrote the bill and proposed it. So I really do sort of commend California for being really sort of progressive and thinking ahead about these things, but it's also a really complicated and difficult issue. I was actually asked to testify for this bill back in April 2018, and I can tell you that the bill then is really, really quite different from the bill as it was passed in the fall of 2018. So the original structure of the bill was basically saying we want basically X% of miles to be electrified by a certain year. So it's kind of along the same lines as a ZEV mandate, but for TNCs. But part of the testimony that I gave was talking about thinking about how TNCs could comply and thinking about the structure, the sort of structural ability of Uber and Lyft to respond to this type of regulation. So if you said, I want half of all miles to be electrified by a specific year, by 2025, and then 100% of miles driven on Uber and Lyft to be electric by 2030. That's super cool and great for thinking about our climate mitigation goals, right? But it ignores some of the implications and reality of how the business operates. So first of all, Uber and Lyft, for the vast majority of their fleets, they don't own the cars, right? So you and I, if we have a vehicle, if we own a vehicle, we are able to participate as a driver for that service. And Uber and Lyft, they don't take possession of our vehicle or anything. So you might want to think about what it would mean to say, okay, no, you can only drive if it's an electric vehicle. So these are sorts of important implications of where your policy goals sort of meet your policy reality. And so it's important to think about a lot of these details to structure sort of well-meaning good policy, or both well-meaning but also sort of realistic policy. Following my testimony, along with a number of other sort of experts, the bill was reformulated, and now it is more of a emissions-based standard, and which we're going to take a look at in a little bit, and see a little bit more of the details. But there are, I think, a lot of pretty interesting, novel things to consider, or to give credit to this bill. So one of the big ones, and I think it's the sort of first in its era, and it'll be really good to see this, is sort of a tie in between both the technological as well as behavioral components. So when you think about something like the CAFE standards or the ZEV mandate, that's all about technology, right? And so they think about improving the efficiency of a car. So, you are requiring an improvement in miles per gallon, or you're requiring an improvement in grams of CO2 per mile. in this case, they have something like that where you're supposed to improve the emissions rate, but it's actually grams of CO2 per passenger mile. And in tying this thing together, now you are attacking it from both the avenue of technology and the avenue of behavior, because they want to promote more people in a single car. And so I think that is super novel. I haven't seen that in any other sort of regulation or legislation. Maybe, I mean, Kelly, you can correct me if I'm wrong. But that's one of the sort of interesting things. And then the other part is that they're actually promoting sort of what is it called? Neutrality across transport modes. So there's consideration for transit, there's consideration for active transport, so things like micromobility. So the companies actually get a benefit, for example, if they actually move riders from their platform in the ride hailing to maybe riding a jump bike or a Lyft scooter, right? And so I think these are all like real creative and novel things that have been introduced into sort of the legislative body, and I think it'll be great to see future regulation and legislation sort of be able to mimic a lot of the groundwork that the Clean Mile Standard has provided. Yeah, and then and so considerations for equity and obviously considerations for greenhouse gas emissions are central to a lot of what this bill is trying to do. Could we go forward? Actually, so could we go forward one more slide and then I'll come back to this one? Yeah, so once the legislation is passed, one of the interesting things to note about the policy process is the legislature doesn't take on the responsibility of enforcing this piece of legislation, or enforcing basically how the rules and standards are met, or even coming up with the rules and the standards. That responsibility gets passed on to the California Air Resources Board. And so they are now required by law, via SB 1014, to come up with the Clean Mile Standard. And I think it's a pretty good system, right? We have legislative bodies and regulatory bodies for a reason. Regulatory bodies such as CARB have the scientific expertise and the sort of manpower to be able to put a big piece of regulation like this together. And so there's lots of details, and we can, if there are more sort of questions about specific aspects of it, I'd be happy, both Kelly and I would be happy to chat about it. But I think central to the formation of the standard is this this equation right here, which is, as I mentioned, basically we want Uber and Lyft to reduce their grams of CO2 per passenger mile. And so what does that entail? Pretty straightforward equation, right? So the number of miles that you go multiplied by the fuel efficiency, and then you convert it to based on the emissions rate. And then you divide by the number of VMT, but multiplied by occupancy, right? So that's how you weight it by the number of passengers. And then they actually give this little extra term at the end, plus the active transit, which allows you to essentially discount your entire numerator by some amount of active and micromobility that's being done. Okay, so fairly straightforward, but then really the devil gets into the details. And I can tell you, we've been actively participating in workshops and meetings to think about a lot of how these numbers get determined. And it is not a straightforward process. So, for example, let's just talk about VMT. So when I call the Uber or Lyft to get a ride, what are the miles that are associated with my travel? And these are the things that they want to account for. Right, great, right on cue. So when the Uber and Lyft gets called, right? They may be circling around with their app on, waiting for a ride to get called, and then they will drive to pick that person up. So in the time that it goes from wherever they were located to picking the person up once they've been matched, that is known as period 2. So period 3 is actually driving the rider from their origin to destination. Period 2 is the length of time, or the length going to pick up the driver or the rider. And then period 1 is like when I'm have the app on, but I haven't yet been matched. And so that would be like if I'm driving around in circles in downtown, waiting to get matched. Those are all extra miles that are happening because I'm trying to provide this service, and I'm like driving to specific locations maybe to get the best probability of picking someone up. And then there's actually even a further aspect of deadheading all of these things, which is something like if I live in Davis but I get paid better rates in San Francisco, then I, as an Uber or Lyft driver, will drive from Davis all the way out to San Francisco before I even turn my app on, right, to provide the service. And so you can think about what it would mean to try and measure these things, right? So how do we account for like people who are coming from Central California into the Bay to provide services? Like how could we feasibly measure that? So there's lots of back and forth, lots of discussion about whether it even makes sense to drive or to count, period 0. There was actually a really interesting anecdote. During one of the workshops, ARB actually invited a real Uber and Lyft driver. He's a veteran driver, does it full time, to provide some insight into how we might think about some of these things. And it was fascinating. One of the things that he was saying was that, well, this period 0 thing might be really inaccurate because some drivers can actually will actually turn on the app on the freeway where they know they're not going to get picked up, and all of those miles are going to get recorded by the app, and it's going to look like extra miles that are deadheading. But in reality, they know that they're not providing rides. Okay, so why do they do this? It turns out that when you have the app on, it counts as something like you're providing the service, and those miles are tax deductible. So the guy actually drove around all the time on the freeway with his app on, and he ended up reducing his tax liability by something like $19,000 in a single year, which is like mind blowing, right? But these are the types of things that like we just wouldn't know. These are things that come from sort of really talking to people who have that experience. So there's like a whole plethora of pretty fascinating little like details that have to get worked out in forming this regulation together. So when we think at a high level about making the policy to do specific goals, that's all well and good. But when it comes down to the like nitty gritty, you start getting into all these crazy details, and that's where like research and science is really helpful to be able to inform this process. Like another one, just really quickly, for example, when we think about period 1 and 2, well, what if these guys are driving for multiple services? Like I have my app on for both Uber and Lyft. Okay, then who gets the like period 1 and period 2 miles? Like, do you split them? Do you allocate them based off of like how many miles are driven for specific services on the actual pickup? And there was a huge amount of debate because there are a whole bunch of small TNC companies that get really little service, and if they got counted evenly in a split, they would get massive amounts of miles that you might consider to be not a fair way of attributing to them. So there's again a whole lot of devil in the details with this sort of work. Could we go back to the equation? Yeah, and so that's like just the BMT part. There are fascinating things about the fuel efficiency part. So, do we just take like the EPA fuel economy numbers? Well, the drive cycle that those assume is that 55% of the time you're on the freeway and 45% of the time you're driving in more sort of urban streets. But that ratio might look super different for an Uber and Lyft driver, which is primarily on more urban stop and go sort of drive cycles. And so that's like a important consideration and how you might measure that. So that in itself has a good deal of controversy as well. Probably the biggest one that I'm not going to spend so much time on is occupancy. We think about occupancy in terms of like basically the number of riders in the car, right? Well, Uber and Lyft, they don't have any way of measuring that. So sure, in pooled rides, they're able to say how many riders, because you actually put in, oh, I'm riding with a friend or something in a pooled ride. But for a regular ride, they don't actually have the ability to consider that. One of the points that I've been trying to bring up to ARB with sort of not so much success is okay, consider this. Suppose you and your buddy go call an Uber, okay? The occupancy for that vehicle is now 2 people because it's you and your friend. And you get in that Uber together and then you drive, and that gets counted in the way that they are describing this. But really, what's the counterfactual for you and your friend going to the same location? Is it that if you hadn't taken the Uber and Lyft, would you guys have gotten in 2 separate cars and driven to the same location, or would you guys have carpooled, right? And so there's also some kind of, even with the occupancy, you might think that for the single trip ordinary, so not pooled rides, that I would personally argue that the occupancy shouldn't be counting all the passengers, because more than likely, you and your family members or close friends getting together in one Uber vehicle, in reality, you guys would have probably driven in the same car. So that's, a complicated consideration, and there are reasons, there are specific reasons about why they wouldn't really want to do that. It does make the accounting easier, if you think about it, because then you wouldn't have to have Uber and Lyft figure out how many passengers there are in a regular ride. But also, the legislative requirement about counting passengers, now you are kind of redefining what it means to be a passenger. And so there's some like legislative, I guess, momentum against doing something like this. And I guess, I'm not going to sort of dive too much more into these specific details, but more to give you guys a sense of like thinking about, when you talk about like a public policy related to, climate change mitigation or emissions reduction sort of thing, or efficiency improvements, in like coursework, and thinking about like more traditional like goals and how to meet them. I think it's also important to keep in perspective like the sorts of difficulties it takes to actually get that policy on the ground, get it through regulation, formulate the regulation to do exactly what you're trying to achieve at the end of the day. So there are kind of fun details to think about when it comes to these sort of things. Okay, should we move on? And maybe Kelly, you want to jump back in? I don't want to hog too much of the clean mile standard stuff. So.
Well, I don't know as much about this stuff as you. I can try to. You should do this slide at least.
Okay, I'm trying to remember what the slide is actually.
You can just skip it if it's. I mean, it's already 8 o'clock, so.
Oh yeah, so we're running behind. Actually, yeah. You thought I was going to go short, but I wasn't so optimistic. Yeah, let's continue on. This is all the stuff that we're showing here is related to some of the work that the California Air Resources Board has already done to justify some of the standards and numbers that they're coming up for the purposes of making the rule. And actually, all of last year they spent doing what's called a baseline. So in 2018 is supposed to be the baseline. So they went in and tried to calculate all the things related to stuff that happened in California on TNC platforms in that year. Yeah, and so I actually can't recall what this. I've seen this one before, but I can't actually recall.
From what I understand, the graph on the left is like current emissions from TNCs, the baseline, and then on the right is what they expect the benefit of the policy to be. So it's cleaner. Yeah, so that's all I really have to say about that. I have this slide on COVID and potential implications on transportation broadly of COVID. Obviously, we don't know exactly what's going to happen or how it's going to play out, but we do know there's likely going to be an impact. So shared mobility, obviously right now, you're not allowed, the apps won't let you do a shared ride. And it's anticipated that people are probably going to be more hesitant to share rides after this. So we need to make sure, it's going to be safe once we have a vaccine, and we're doing sanitation and trying to still encourage people to share. Obviously, public transportation has taken quite a financial hit from all of this. The first stimulus package provided funding for public transportation, but from what I understand, it's not enough in most cities. So hopefully the next iteration will have a little bit more, but as we know, there's some contention there about the value of public transportation. And then e-commerce is seeing a stimulus. Obviously, more people are ordering things online since it's harder to get to grocery stores. Sorry, that's my dog behind me. It's harder to, it's easier to not come in contact with people when you have things delivered. So we're seeing a bit of a stimulus there that has some emissions implications, especially if people continue that habit once we're allowed to gather en masse again. And as Jake alluded to at the beginning, we have seen that oil is quickly crashing, and there are a couple of reasons for that. One is COVID. The demand has plummeted since most of us aren't traveling as much, but also there was already kind of a price war going on between Saudi Arabia and Russia and OPEC, with trying to drive the U.S. producers out of market. So that was simultaneous, and it kind of resulted in this unprecedented crash in oil prices. And as you saw yesterday, it was negative. It closed at negative $38 a barrel for Western Texas. And yeah, the reason is we don't have places to store the oil that's already been purchased. Like, we've literally run out of places to put it. I think it closed above zero today, so at least we're in the plus now. But there could be potential opportunities to tack a carbon price on, or start putting a price floor on oil to make it net positive. That has implications too for cost of EVs. If gas is really cheap, it's like $1.10 in some areas in the country. It's going to take longer to pay off the upfront cost of an EV, so that's not good for EV sales. And same with transit. I mean, if it costs you less per mile to drive your own car, you're probably going to choose to drive it more often than you're going to choose to take a bike or a bus or a train. Some positives, we've seen a lot of cities closing their streets down so that people can bike and walk around more easily without coming into close contact with people, and it's possible that some of the policies will stick around. I saw today, I think it's in Amsterdam or Italy maybe, where the governor, or not governor, but whatever the equivalent is there, said that they weren't going to go back to having streets be mainly for cars. So at least in Europe, they're considering permanently putting into place more pedestrian and cycling friendly policies permanently. Hopefully that sticks in some cities here. And then at Congress, the Republicans have said that they want to focus more on automated vehicle legislation, which could be good or bad, but right now the federal government is doing nothing on automated vehicles, which is arguably a bad thing. So it's good that they're starting to think about it more. Putting in anything is better than nothing, and just letting some guy in his garage put an automated vehicle on the road. That's just objectively not safe.
Yeah. And I'll quickly mention that actually, since the state has shut down, the California Air Resources Board actually did hold a private and a public workshop on Clean Mile Standard, and it's been pretty interesting. They're kind of proceeding along as is, continuing with doing their analysis, but there is a lot of uncertainty about what the coronavirus long-term impacts may mean for the ability of ARB and TNCs to handle this regulation, right? So even as Kelly mentioned, like the oil crisis, that's going to make the math for drivers, figuring out whether to balance, how to balance, a higher premium for fuel efficiency versus a cheaper car that's less fuel efficient, more complicated, because now maybe it may make more sense to get a Toyota Camry instead of a Toyota Prius because the premium's lower and the gas prices are low enough that the delta in savings is actually better. So there are a lot of like pretty specific issues with coronavirus and the buying and travel behavior, both short term and long term for Clean Mile Standard.
Yeah, so that's really all we have. We time for discussion if anyone wants to talk more about this or has questions. And I can stop sharing this, put our emails in, and put it back up if you all want to ask us questions in the future.
I do see some questions in the chat. So about the oil, it's important to mention that one of the main reasons is the future contract. So yeah, they are futures, and it's like speculation and people investing in the oil. But the funny thing about the futures is that like they deal with these commodities, so it's not like dealing with hypothetical like prices. It's actually dealing with the goods themselves. So like someone is responsible for picking up all that oil, and that's part of what drives the future prices down, is because they don't have room basically to take it. And then there's another question. Could you explain a little more on the relationship between COVID-19 and AVs?
Yeah, so mainly it's a sanitation thing. My dog is like knocking things over in the background. Sorry. I think that they're picking this up because they're seeing, if there's a person not in a car that can deliver things to you without you having to come in contact with a human, like there's a opportunity there. Or like if you're sick and you need to go to the hospital, you could take an AV and not come into contact with another person. But in terms of what the federal government is doing on AVs right now, I just published a paper you can see on our website that it talks about all of the state policies for AVs, and the federal government has failed to pass any legislation in Congress on this. They've introduced a couple bills and it's failed because there's kind of a disagreement between Democrats and Republicans on balancing priorities for innovation and regulations. And so the federal government basically they've said that they've provided these guidelines from DOT, and that's started under the Obama administration. And then when Trump came in, he kind of undid a lot of those regulations and said, here are some guidelines, but there's not actually any like concrete guidelines for people to follow. And it's resulted in this confusion of like what exactly is legal if a state doesn't have any policies. And there's no consideration for environmental regulations or equity at all at the federal level.
That'll be with the next presidency and the new Democratic Senate in 2021.
I'm not endorsing on behalf of UC Davis.
All right, this video is recorded.
Okay, I have a couple questions. I guess first question is about the Clean Mile Standard. Can you clarify like there's a date by which they set the baseline and then they reconvene and decide the targets? Can you clarify the like?
Yeah. So the general timeline in 2019 is when they were trying to figure out the baseline, which means what are the emissions basically that happened in 2018, and so that's been completed, and now there is by the end of this year they have to set the actual standards that roll into place in 2021, 2022. And starting from there, it'll be something like, okay, so I'll just throw a number out there because I don't actually know what it's going to be. So say it's like 200 grams per passenger mile. And then that would be the number in, say that's the baseline. So in 2018, then they'll say, well, in 2022, then it has to go down to 180 grams per passenger mile, and then 160, and so on and so forth. And so you can meet that by, electrifying your vehicles, driving more fuel-efficient vehicles, reducing the BMT relative to your other activities, right? And so there's a whole bunch of ways that companies can comply with the regulation.
Okay, and then second question related is, do you guys have like a sense of how much? I'm curious about the politics, like how much political capital Uber and Lyft had when the Clean Mile Standard was first passed, and whether you think that's gone down or gone up like since then, and whether you think like the passage of AB5, which is making Uber and Lyft drivers essentially changing the way that their labor is regulated, whether you think that affects kind of like, I don't know, like how much clout Uber and Lyft have in the legislature.
I mean, I wouldn't say they have. It's not as though they're like buying politicians or anything, right? So I think that when it comes to them influencing policy, they can really only do so in sort of reasonable ways. So there are, and in fact, when I went to testify, Lyft was there, Uber was not. Uber was neutral, Lyft came out sort of against it, but in sort of a constructive way. They weren't just saying like, oh, this is terrible policy. They were saying, well, there are certain considerations of how you structure the bill right now that don't really make sense given the way our business operates. And so they would talk about that. And I think that a lot of that is sort of reasonable. When it comes to like now in the regulatory stage and the formation of the regulation, they're definitely big players. They come to all the workshops and they provide their sort of perspective about what things they think make sense and what things don't make sense. And, you can, I don't know, I would say that most people can tell when it's like something that's like, oh, they're definitely angling for a specific type of like benefit or incentive, and yeah, okay. But then there's other times where it's like, okay, what they're saying really does kind of make sense, and we should think about as you do this regulation. And so they're definitely players in that whole conversation. But I don't know if I would. I guess I'm not sure I would put it as like they have like political power and leverage, right? It's about contributing to the process. Yeah. I don't know, Kelly. What do you think about that?
Yeah, they've been present at a lot of the workshops that we hosted with them. But it seems like, I've seen positive interactions with that. Like they seem very open and they're embracing this policy and working with regulators and policymakers to make it in a way. They obviously have a bottom line to think about, and we need more representation. That's something I wanted to bring up too. We need more representation from like community organizations and like drivers organizations and people who are actually being impacted at the front line of this, rather than like a corporation saying, I don't know, drivers are getting paid as much. But it seems like there's a good open dialogue there. Maybe we just have good people that come up to our workshops. I like them. I don't know.
Yeah, that's true. It does depend who you talk to at Uber and
Lyft. I feel like where things get tricky for me, at least, is with like the autonomous vehicles or automated vehicles, like whether or not they are displacing workers from communities that may not otherwise get electric vehicles, like if they're part of fleets. So how is that being addressed in the standard? Or maybe there's a different part of or a different bill that's like trying to address the equity issues around electric vehicles. But yeah, I don't know. I was just wondering about that.
Yeah, so equity is definitely a big concern. And actually the slide Kelly, that you showed with the urbanicity. Yeah, so I haven't really brushed up on this portion of the regulation, but if and forgive me if I get this totally incorrect, but they're trying to figure out essentially a way of regionalizing the standards such that they take some of these issues into account, and they want to be able to, at the very least, understand the like cost implications on a social level for putting a specific regulation in place. And so there's a whole team of people at ARB who are specifically trying to understand at least the implications of the regulation. And I can't say I'm super clear about how that may influence how the regulation ultimately gets how the standards get formed, but it is something that they are thinking about.
Yeah, I think you're gonna need this policy and other policies to really make sure that people aren't being displaced even more. But the way where they're kind of trying to incentivize these companies to partner with transit agencies and make sure people have access to transit with these like first last mile solutions is a good way to improve equity, as gentrification makes things worse and people are getting sprawled further out away from urban cores. A lot of them don't live within like walking distance to public transit. And then on top of that, a lot of the workers who are working midnight shifts and graveyard shifts where public transportation is not running, like automated vehicles and TNCs can serve to kind of bridge that gap with them and actually improve their mobility instead of making them be forced to buy a car or walk crazy distances to get to work.
I see a question in chat. Does the Clean Mile Standard regulate TNC good delivery services? So no, it does not. It's only considering passenger travel. And so that actually came up in the last workshop. And they are not going to be counting miles that are for the delivery of goods and services, just of people.
But correct me if I'm wrong, Alan, aren't they going to start counting like the redistribution of scooters and jump bikes?
Yes, they are.
Okay.
But that's not like, they consider that as like part of supporting the service that moves people, right? Because it's like, because you have to do the redistribution in order to have people riding the scooters and bikes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't know they were doing that. Yeah. That's
it's
funny.
It's a little complicated how they're trying to figure out how to do that. I don't quite understand, but
yeah. Well, the way I did it in my life cycle assessment paper was just talk to two drivers,
talking to the drivers. I don't
estimate
know
their average miles and multiply it by some factor. So hopefully they can do better than that.
No, I think they're requiring reporting from the TNCs.
And I imagine that gets complicated with like different models that different companies use. Like Jump has a van.
Mm-hmm.
Bird has like the teenagers who find it on their app and get paid to take on some money, and there's one in an alley or like a bush.
Yep. Fun times.
Yeah.
So what do you guys know, like, has Uber and Lyft banned pooling for COVID?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. There's no, it's not even, I don't even think it's just, they're just, it's completely gone. In fact, like even the micromobility like services have been shutting down. So
yeah,
is that right, Kelly? Like there's no more jump bikes, right?
I think it depends on the city and it depends on the company.
So I meant in Davis and Sacramento.
Yeah, there's none here. And I know in San Diego there aren't any because we're doing a project and we just talked to them. But I think in Europe in particular, and then like initially in San Francisco, I think the city bikes were getting more use because people were afraid of taking the bus or the train. But I don't know if they pulled all of like the docked bikes out. I think they've just been sanitizing them more because people want to ride them now, like more than they were.
They're like shared bikes, right? Like you're holding the same handles that other people are holding.
Yeah, but I guess people are just like spraying them down right before they use them. And then I read something, the same thing in China, like they were seeing like 4 times the usage of their bike shares than normal.
crazy.
Yeah.
Jake, we'll have to look at the GBFS data.
Yeah, I
See
know,
what
dude. I
happened.
think it'll be interesting. Just like
Yeah, I think
one
there will
day
be
it
some
stopped.
case studies out of COVID for transportation.
Sorry, Jake.
No,
No,
go ahead.
I wasn't gonna say anything. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
This is unrelated to the Clean Mile standard, but more just in general of like how California should spend money on like EV transition. I've heard people talking about like maybe putting more money for like leasing programs instead of like actual purchasing programs, just so that it's like a quicker transition to used cars for electric vehicles. Is there any basis to that, or is that just kind of a silly idea?
No, that's it's an interesting idea. Although I would say that the vehicle leases do get incentives. So you do have incentivization of those programs. I would say, I guess kind of going back to TNC's, the like rental model where you can do like week-long or month-long rentals for short term kind of makes sense in to think about overcoming, especially for low-income adopters, the initial sort of purchasing price barrier. And so there has been some discussion of that. Nothing sort of formalized yet, but it would be. I think it makes a lot of sense in terms of fleet vehicles and being used for these platforms, shorter term sorts of incentives.
Yeah, and I know there's talk of expanding the tax credit to used vehicles, but trying to do it in a way that doesn't like incentivize people to buy a new car and then immediately sell it to someone else who can use the same tax incentive. But that is an equity thing. Yeah.
I think there's a lot of difficult issues to get around incentivizing used vehicles because like the pass-through is a lot more fuzzy. Like dealerships could take advantage of people much easier. I don't know. It's definitely a very interesting topic, and actually it's been active in the legislative sessions. There have been at least a half dozen bills that have considered used EV incentives.
And at the federal level, I know a lot of bills have been introduced, mostly in the House, a couple in the Senate, but that generally don't pass through committee. But I mean, if you don't know how the federal legislation works, usually like Democrats are obviously the ones passing these bills, and they're basically writing them all so that if a point in time comes where they can actually pass them and get them onto the floor and have a president who will sign it, they have them all ready to go. So it's worth following for that reason, even though it's not going to happen anytime soon.
Well, January 2021, we're going to get so many great bills passed. If everyone here votes.
Do you guys have a sense of how this downturn is going to affect like EV infrastructure build out? Because like I just imagine that it's going to be bad, but on the other hand, like it seems like the perfect time for government spending on EV infrastructure as a way to stimulate the economy. I don't know. Do you have any thoughts?
I literally haven't thought about that yet. It's an interesting thought.
I haven't thought about the infrastructure part. Just sales in general, it's like probably a bad thing. Like, not only will people not get the cost savings from EVs, but the whole auto industry is probably taking a downturn, so people won't be buying new cars at all. They're going to continue driving less efficient ones.
Yeah, probably. Yeah, recessions do tend to get people to hold on to their cars for a longer time. So,
but there's an opportunity, kind of like the cash for clunkers one. Mm-hmm. Someone came up with it, like, what is it? cash for combustors or something instead, like fitting in your combustion car for EV.
That'd be pretty sweet.
Yeah.
So in that case, do you think that this policy would be revised so since we are going through such a bad recession?
The standards that they're going to put out at the end of the year may get affected. I don't know if it will, if they're going to kind of continue as status quo, or if they're really going to try and think about the long-term effects of coronavirus. I guess we'll see. I mean, I'm not a prophet or an oracle or anything, so.
Yeah.
Alrighty. Let's see. Any other
I put up my email
thoughts?
and Alan's emails and Twitter handles up there if you have
Sweet.
questions and tell me if I got those wrong, Alan. I can change it.
That seems about right.
Okay.
I don't remember what my Twitter handle is.
I looked it up. I think it was just your name.
Yeah, I barely use it. You need to help me be more active.
Jake tweeted about this and I retweeted it. Your tag.
Well, you need to be my Twitter coach and just tell me to like go on Twitter once a day and like post something.
Everyone tweet at Alan so he has more notifications.
Yeah.
Thank you guys both so much for doing this on a short notice. I thought it was really cool overview of transportation and TNCs and
Thanks for having us. Yeah. It was fun.